In a luxurious gala filled with politicians, journalists, and millionaires, a powerful man takes the stage, decided to publicly destroy his own wife before 100 witnesses. Among shocking accusations, mysterious documents, and cell phones pointed like judgment cameras. The entire hall believes they are witnessing the definitive fall of a woman. But when she faints in the middle of the scandal, and a man feared throughout the city crosses the crowd to hold her in his arms, silence takes over the room. Because in that instant, everyone realizes that the night's power game was far from over, and that someone just challenged the wrong man. Before discovering how this night turned into one of the most explosive scandals ever seen, subscribe to the channel and prepare for a story full of tension, secrets, and surprising twists. The hall of the Museu do Ipiranga had never received so many eyes at the same time. Restored with public funds and inaugurated in grand style, the space had become Renato Cavalcanti's favorite symbol whenever he needed to remind the world how much his name was synonymous with progress. The white marble columns reflected the golden light of the imported chandeliers, and the smell of fresh flowers, white orchids arranged in monumental displays, mixed with the expensive perfume of the guests who paraded through the main corridor with the naturalness of those who never doubted their own place in the world. It was a Thursday in May, and São Paulo had chosen that night to be generous with the sky. Not a single cloud. The high windows of the museum framed the illuminated city below, as if the urban scenery itself were part of the decoration hired by Cavalcanti for the benefit gala of the Reconstruir Foundation. 100 guests, each one selected with surgical precision, journalists from major circulation outlets, top-tier businessmen, city councillors, deputies, 2 senators, and at least 3 names tipped for positions in the next state government. People who formed opinions, people whose words the next day would be repeated, published, shared. No detail had been left to chance. In the center of the hall, on a table covered by a raw linen tablecloth, rested the commemorative cake, 3 tiers of white fondant with gold details, topped by the foundation's symbol sculpted in sugar. An edible work of art that no one would dare cut before the main speech. Around the tables, waiters glided with trays of French champagne and elaborate canapés, responding with trained smiles to requests that arrived in whispers. Renato Cavalcanti was at the center of everything, as always. Tall in a navy blue suit with a burgundy pocket square, he moved between groups with the fluidity of someone who had learned early on that true power is not imposed. It radiates. He shook hands, tilted his head slightly to the older women, laughed just the right amount at the businessmen's jokes, and left each interlocutor with the feeling of having been the only one in the room to deserve full attention. It was a rare talent, cultivated with discipline. A few meters from him, alone before one of the windows, was Camilla. Emerald green dress, tight cut, dark hair tied in a low bun that left the back of her neck exposed. From the window she observed the city without really seeing it. Her eyes scanned the distant lights, with the expression of someone who learned to appear serene even when everything inside is collapsing. There was a particular quality to Camilla Cavalcanti's posture, the straight spine, the slightly raised chin, that people used to call elegance. That night, however, it was just the reflection of years practicing the art of not falling apart in public. A journalist approached with a wide smile and a recorder already in hand. "Dr. Camilla, what a pleasure to see you. You look stunning as always. Senator Cavalcanti must be proud." Camilla turned with the controlled slowness of someone who knows that every movement will be remembered. "Thank you, Fernanda. It is always good to see you here. The foundation grew a lot this year. New projects in Heliopolis, it seems?" "Yes, the work continues." A calculated pause. Renato believes very much in this cause. The journalist noted something down, thanked her, and moved on. Camilla turned back to the window. Her fingers found the gold and diamond ring on her ring finger and squeezed slightly, like someone checking a handcuff that is going nowhere. On the other side of the hall, Renato observed the scene with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The night was still young. The speech was scheduled for 10 o'clock. There were 40 minutes left, and he had plans for each of them. Camilla did not know what was coming, or perhaps she knew in some way that the body registers before the mind can name it. There was something in the air that night, a tension that the golden chandeliers could not disguise, a strange vibration that mixed with the murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses. Like when the sky turns green before a storm and everyone pretends not to have noticed. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and took a small sip just to have something to do with her hands. Her eyes swept the hall with discretion. She recognized faces. Prosecutor Alcantara, who had dined at her house 3 weeks before. Deputy Soraya Mendez, who owed 2 votes of gratitude to the Cavalcanti name. The businessman Helio Braga, whose constructions in São Paulo depended on licenses that passed through her husband's hands. Everyone was there. Everyone on that specific night. A choice she was beginning to understand too late. At the back of the hall, almost leaning against the stone wall that the restorer had decided to leave visible as an architectural detail, there was a man Camilla did not immediately recognize. White shirt, no tie, dark jacket. It was not the type of attire for that occasion, not formal enough, but the man wore it with an indifference that paradoxically made him more present than any of the embroidered suits around him. He did not talk to anyone. He had a glass in his hand that he had not brought to his mouth a single time since Camilla had begun observing him. And he was looking at her, not with the light curiosity of someone admiring a pretty dress at a party. It was another type of look, something between recognition and calculation, as if he already knew things that had not yet been said out loud. Camilla looked away. From the stage, an assistant of Renato's gave 3 little claps with his hands to draw attention. The senator was about to step up to the microphone. The guests began to organize themselves in a semicircle, glasses in hand, expressions attentive and slightly bored with the type of sophisticated boredom that affects those who attend many events like that one. Renato climbed onto the stage with slow and sure steps. He adjusted the microphone, smiled at the audience, and let silence settle for a few seconds. An old, effective trick that created the illusion that every word about to be said had been thought specifically for that moment. "Thank you all for being here," he began with the deep and well-placed voice of someone who spent years learning to speak to crowds. "This night is special, not just for everything the Reconstruir Foundation represents, but because there are things that need to be said, things that can no longer wait." Camilla felt the champagne turn into stone in her stomach, and from the back of the hall, the man in the dark jacket slightly closed his eyes, like someone preparing for a fall that he had already calculated with precision. Renato Cavalcanti's voice filled the hall with that cadence he had perfected over 2 decades in politics. He began with gratitude, to the sponsors, to the partners, to the institutions that had believed in the Reconstruir Foundation since the first day. He cited numbers. He spoke of children served, of neighborhoods transformed, of lives that had changed direction thanks to the Foundation's work. The audience responded with smiles and nods, and some of the journalists present were already typing on their cell phones the first fragments of what would be published the next day. Camilla stood where she was, a few meters from the stage, with the glass in her hand and her gaze fixed on a point between the marble floor and her husband's face. She had learned, over time, to listen to Renato's speeches like someone listening to a foreign language they understand almost completely. Every calculated pause, every inflection of voice, every moment he lowered his head to convey humility and raised his eyes to convey vision. It was a performance that had once impressed Camilla herself, years ago. Now she recognized it in every detail without feeling anything but a deep exhaustion. "But tonight," Renato said, and there was something different in the tone now, a hardness that appeared suddenly like a stone under a soft fabric. "I did not come here just to celebrate." The audience noticed the change. Side conversations ceased. Businessman Helio Braga furrowed his brow. Deputy Soraya Mendez discreetly turned her face to an assistant beside her. Renato stepped down from the stage with slow steps, and an assistant handed him a brown leather folder that seemed to have been prepared specifically for that moment. He opened it carefully, like someone dealing with something precious or dangerous, and swept the room with his eyes before speaking. "A few months ago, while reviewing the Foundation's accounts with the internal audit, I found irregularities. Serious irregularities." Pause. Unauthorized transfers. Movements that were not in the official reports. Money that should have reached the communities and never arrived. The silence that settled in the hall had a different texture than the usual silence of galas. It was the silence of someone about to watch something that was not on the program. Camilla felt her legs grow heavy. "The documents I have here," Renato continued, raising the folder slightly, "record with precision every movement, the values, the dates, those responsible. And I want everyone present to see, because I believe that transparency is the only path when it comes to public money and trust." He walked to the center of the hall and opened the folder on one of the tables. Some guests approached, curious. One of Renato's assistants began to distribute printed copies among the people closest. Journalists moved forward. Camilla did not need to approach to understand what was happening. Her name was printed on those sheets. She knew. For weeks, a vague and formless fear had taken hold of her whenever her husband looked at her in a specific way, like someone keeping a secret too big not to be revealed at some point. Now the moment had arrived, and it was worse than anything she had imagined, because he had chosen the worst possible place for it to happen. "My wife, Camilla Cavalcanti, managed the Foundation's operational accounts," Renato said, returning to the center of the hall, his voice firm and the expression of someone who regrets what he is forced to say. "And the records show that during the last 3 years, expressive values were diverted to accounts that appear linked to her name. The entire hall turned to her. 100 pairs of eyes. Cell phone cameras rose like antennas. Someone whispered something in another person's ear, and the whisper multiplied until it became a murmur that traveled through the space like electricity." Camilla did not move. The posture the world called elegance now served as the only armor available. She did not cry, did not scream, did not do what Renato probably expected her to do, collapse, confirming the narrative with her own breakdown. Instead, she stood tall in her emerald green dress with her gaze fixed on her husband, and what was in that gaze was not guilt. It was the recognition of a trap that had been closed with precision. "These documents," Renato continued with a rehearsed sadness that reached the point of being offensive, "are the proof of a betrayal that goes beyond the personal. It is a betrayal of the city, of the families who depended on these resources, and of all of you who always supported our work." Prosecutor Alcantara took a step toward the distributed sheets. Deputy Soraya Mendez said something in a low voice to the assistant beside her. Cameras remained raised. It was then that Camilla's body, which had resisted with all the discipline accumulated in years of silent survival, simply decided there was nothing left to sustain. The hall rippled in front of her. The smell of the orchids became too strong. The sound of the voices became a uniform buzz. She took a step to the side unintentionally, and her shoulder hit the edge of the central table, the one with the monumental 3-tier cake, and the impact was enough for the fondant and sugar structure to lose its balance and topple in slow motion onto the marble floor with a crash that pierced the silence of the hall like a gunshot, and then she fell as well. The chaos that ensued lasted exactly the seconds it takes for 100 people to process 2 simultaneous collapses, that of the cake and that of the woman everyone had just condemned. Someone screamed. Someone asked for a doctor. Cell phones that were previously filming the speech were now filming the floor, the figure of Camilla among the fragments of white and gold fondant, the emerald green dress contrasting with the cold marble. Renato Cavalcanti stood motionless in the center of the hall for an instant that those who were close enough saw clearly. It was not surprise on his face. It was calculation, the assessment of someone checking if the result of a plan came out as expected. And from the back of the hall, where he had remained standing the whole time, the man in the dark jacket began to move. He crossed the crowd with a calm that did not match the chaos around him, dodging stationary people and shards of sugar on the floor without losing his rhythm, as if the path to her had already been traced for a long time. He arrived before anyone else. He knelt beside Camilla, passed one arm under her knees and another under her back, and lifted her from the floor with a firmness that required no apparent effort. The entire hall saw, and Renato Cavalcanti, who had prepared every detail of that night to end exactly the way he wanted, took the microphone again and said, with a hardness he no longer bothered to disguise, "Drop my wife now." The man turned slowly, with Camilla in his arms, and met Renato's eyes across the entire audience. And when he spoke, his voice was low enough that only those closest heard. But the silence of the hall was complete, and it was enough for it to reach everyone. Get away from her before you regret it. No shouting, no elaborate threats, just those words, said with the tranquility of someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, and which for that very reason were the most frightening the hall had heard all night. 100 guests froze at the same time, because some there recognized the man's face. And those who recognized it understood in silence that Renato Cavalcanti had just challenged the only person in that hall who could not be challenged with impunity. 4 months before that night, São Paulo had the grey and damp aspect of a winter that couldn't decide whether to stay or go. The streets of Itaim were wet at 11 at night, the sidewalks almost empty, the traffic reduced to a thread of red and yellow headlights slowly moving away. It was the type of night when the city seemed smaller than usual, more honest, without the daytime performance of grandeur. Bar Sombra was on a side street that didn't appear on delivery apps, which was exactly the point. Nothing on the facade was inviting. A dark wooden door with no visible sign, a window with closed shutters, amber light leaking through the cracks. Inside, the space was the exact size of a secret. 8 tables, a long counter, instrumental music at a volume low enough so that conversations stayed between those who started them. It was a place that had found its audience without needing to look for it. People who wanted to exist for a few hours without being recognized, without representing anything, without needing to smile at anyone. Camilla had arrived for the first time in August, 3 weeks after an argument with Renato that had left marks that were not visible, but that she felt when breathing deeply. She hadn't told anyone this. There was no one to tell. On that August night, she had ordered a whiskey she barely drank, stayed alone at a corner table for 2 hours, and left without speaking to anyone. She had returned the following week, and the one after, always late, always alone, always with the impeccable appearance of someone who needs nothing, which, for those who knew how to look, was exactly the opposite of the truth. Lucas Menezes was sitting at the counter the 3rd time she appeared. He was not a regular. He appeared when he had something to resolve in his head, that type of thing that needs a quiet place and a slow drink to find shape. The barman, Seu Gilberto, who knew both of them by the same criteria of silence and respect, made no introductions. He simply let the space exist. Lucas had noticed Camila since the first time, because it was impossible not to notice. Not for obvious beauty, but for something that was wrong in a way he recognized. He had worked enough years in the city's shadows to develop a type of perception that functioned like an alarm. The specific tension in the shoulders of someone expecting an impact, the way the eyes check the door every time it opens, the hand that instinctively rises to cover an arm even when there is nothing to cover. They were small scattered signs that most people around didn't process because they weren't trained to process them. Lucas was. He didn't approach on the 3rd night, nor on the 4th. There was an ethic in the type of observation he practiced. You don't interrupt someone who is in the only place where they feel safe to breathe. So he stayed at the counter, ordered what he always ordered, and let time do the work. It was on the 5th time Camilla arrived at the bar that something changed. It was a Friday, and she arrived earlier than usual, without the impeccable bun, her hair loose and slightly damp, as if she had left home in a hurry. She sat at the counter this time, 2 seats away from Lucas, and asked for a glass of water before the whiskey. Her fingers were slightly trembling. Lucas said nothing for 10 minutes. Then he asked Gilberto for another of what he was drinking, pushed the glass toward her without looking directly, and said only, "If you want." Camilla looked at the glass, then at him. There was distrust in her eyes, that type of distrust that isn't about the person in front of you, but about the world in general, built slowly by disappointments that accumulate until they become a reflex. But there was also exhaustion, and the exhaustion that night was greater than the distrust. She took the glass. "Thank you. You're welcome." Silence. Not the uncomfortable silence that asks to be filled, but the other type, the one that exists between people who don't need to pretend everything is fine to be in the same space. For 20 minutes, they stayed like that, side by side at the counter, looking forward without speaking. Then Camilla said, without preamble, without introduction, "You didn't ask my name." "I didn't need to." Everyone asks the name. Most people ask the name to have something from you. He swirled the glass between his hands. "You don't seem to be here to give anything to anyone." She was quiet for a moment. "Lucas," he said, extending his hand without ceremony. "Camilla." And that was it. Simple, unpretentious, without any of the formalities she had spent years executing, with precision at events, dinners and receptions, where every introduction was also a negotiation. Just two names exchanged in a bar that no one knew, in a city that slept outside with indifference. In the following weeks, they began meeting without planning, or perhaps planning without realizing at that time and in that place that had become, for both, an interval from the rest. Camilla gradually released fragments of her own story, without a linear narrative, without a clearly defined beginning or end. A sentence here, a long pause there, a look away that said more than words. Lucas listened without pushing. He had learned that the most important stories arrive at the pace of those who carry them, and that any haste transforms listening into an interrogation. It took 4 weeks for her to say, on a Tuesday in September with heavy rain outside, while rolling a paper napkin between her fingers, "I signed documents that I don't completely understand. It's been years." Lucas didn't raise his eyes from his glass. "What kind of documents?" "Transfers, contracts, accounts of the foundation Renato created. He always presents them when he's in a hurry, or when we've just argued, or when I'm too exhausted to ask questions. He says it's bureaucracy, that he needs my signature because I'm co-director on paper. That he'll explain to me later." A pause. "The later never arrives." Lucas waited. "He keeps everything," she said lower. "Every signature. I discovered it by accident. He has a folder, locked, in the home office. One day the key was in the lock and I didn't open it, but I saw enough to know they are documents with my name. Many of them." It was there that something organized itself in Lucas Menezes' head, with the cold precision of someone who recognizes a pattern they've seen before, in different contexts, but with the same architecture. He said nothing that night. He let her finish her drink, called a car for her, and stayed alone at the counter for another hour, looking at the reflection of the lights on the wet sidewalk through the bar's window pane. Something was being built against that woman, and it was close to being ready. Lucas Menezes was not the type of man who appeared in business magazine profiles or on lists of influential people. His name was not on any board of directors, did not appear on any council, did not show up in award ceremonies. There were people in São Paulo who knew him as a corporate security consultant, a definition vague enough to be true without revealing anything. There were others who knew him in ways that didn't fit simple definitions. What everyone who knew him had in common was a respect that didn't need demonstration to exist. He had built this respect over 15 years in jobs that required discretion above any other quality. Internal investigations in companies that couldn't call the police without generating scandals. Recovery of assets diverted by partners who were also brothers-in-law or godparents. Protection of people who had very precise reasons for not wanting to be found. He knew how powerful people built traps for vulnerable people because he had dismantled such traps more than once. He knew the logic, the architecture of fabricated guilt. Therefore, on the morning after the conversation at Bar Sombra, Lucas did what he knew how to do. He began with the public records of the Reconstruir Foundation, annual balance sheets, audit reports, certificates of incorporation. Documents that anyone could access, but that very few had the patience or training to read with enough attention to see what was hidden between the lines. And what Lucas found between the lines was sophisticated work, years of careful preparation, overlapping layers of legitimate documentation mixed with transfers that appeared legitimate but were not, and which had one thing in common. Camilla Cavalcanti's name appeared with a frequency that was no coincidence. Co-executive director, responsible for operational accounts, authorized to move values up to a certain limit, signatures on payment orders that corresponded with millimetric precision to dates Camilla had mentioned, without knowing what she was mentioning, intense discussions with Renato, pressure to sign quickly, manufactured urgency. Lucas took notes, organized a chronology, made calls that were not recorded anywhere. 3 days later, he had enough to understand the dimension of what was being set up. Renato Cavalcanti was a man who planned with generous lead time. The The scheme had not been improvised. It had been orchestrated with the patience of someone who knows that the best trap is the one the target helps build without realizing it. For 3 years he had used Camilla's position as co-director to give a legitimate appearance to movements that diverted resources to shell companies registered in the names of third parties, but with traceable connections back to accounts he controlled. The engineering was elegant. The money went out in small installments, through different channels, at intervals calculated not to set off alarms in audits. And every exit had Camilla's signature. The plan, Lucas deduced, was simple in its cruelty. When the scheme came to light, and Renato needed it to come to light, because he was building the narrative of a victim to leave the marriage with clean hands, all evidence would point to his wife. He would appear as the betrayed man, deceived by the woman in whom he had placed trust, willing to collaborate with the authorities. Camilla would be left with the accusations, the documents, the judicial pressure, and without the resources necessary to hire an adequate defense, since the accounts she could access would be blocked as part of the process. It was a programmed demolition, methodical, cold. Lucas sat before the screens for a long time after assembling this picture. There were cases he took out of professionalism, and cases he took for other reasons. This one had crossed a line that was not purely professional, and he was aware of that, which was relevant because awareness of personal motivations is exactly what prevents them from harming the work. Camilla didn't know any of this yet. He had decided not to tell her until he had enough proof to transform the information into real protection, and not just another way to place a burden on her that had nowhere to go. In the following days, Lucas expanded the investigation. He had contacts in notary offices, in business registration offices, in compliance sectors of banks that owed him undocumented favors. He asked them to verify the registration data of the companies to which the resources had been transferred. He requested, through channels that didn't need to be explained, recordings of conversations in corporate environments where Renato's name appeared frequently in recent months. What he found went beyond what he expected. Renato had committed an error of vanity, the type of error very intelligent people commit, because intelligence at some point begins to look like invincibility. He had talked about the plan, not in full detail, not with people who would be obvious witnesses, but enough. A conversation with a trusted assistant in an office that had a private security system, a system Lucas knew because he had installed similar systems. An exchange of voice messages in an app that promised encryption, but whose servers passed through an infrastructure Lucas knew for other reasons. In less than 2 weeks, he had enough to completely invert the narrative. The question was when and how to use it. Lucas considered taking it directly to Prosecutor Alcantara, who had a reputation for enough independence to act on solid evidence. He considered passing it to the newsrooms of journalists whose work he knew and respected. He considered a series of moves that would have protected Camilla efficiently, but that would also have allowed Renato to leave with some kind of control over the narrative, enough time to reformulate the version, hire lawyers, create distance between himself and what he had built. And it was then that Lucas understood that the only way to ensure Renato had no way out was to let the trap be set until the end. Because if Renato chose a stage to destroy Camilla, the same stage could be used to destroy him, and with 100 witnesses present. There was a gala scheduled. Lucas knew about the gala because Camilla had mentioned, without knowing the dimension of what she was mentioning, that Renato had insisted very much on her presence that specific night. There was something in the way he insisted that she had described, a particular emphasis, an unusual care with the outfit she would wear, an interest in the guest list that he normally didn't demonstrate, which Lucas recognized as the last step before the final blow, so he began to prepare the response. While Renato chose the shoe he would use to trample his wife in public, Lucas organized every piece with the calm of someone who is in no hurry because he already knows the result. Not because he was arrogant, but because he had done the math, and the math added up. On that May afternoon, 4 hours before the gala began, Lucas was in the discreet office he maintained in Pinheiros, surrounded by papers and screens, checking every detail for the last time. There was a person on the museum's technical team who knew exactly what to do when they received the signal. The files were organized, the recordings edited only to remove what was not relevant, the documents authenticated by a source that could not be questioned. Lucas closed the computer, put on his dark jacket and left. He was not going to a gala. He was going to the end of a story that Renato Cavalcanti had started thinking he controlled, and that would end in a way he had not included in any of his careful plans. The fresh air of the museum's side corridor arrived like a shock after the condensed heat of the hall. Lucas had left through the service exit, a door he had mapped at the beginning of the night, before anything started, with the same naturalness with which he always mapped exits. Camilla was in his arms, still not fully conscious, her head resting against his shoulder, her breathing irregular but present. Behind them, the hall had been left in a state that was neither chaos nor order, but that intermediate space where events too large to be processed at the time leave people suspended in their own reasonings. Lucas had heard before leaving the sound of voices rising again, the collective murmur that precedes the reorganization of thought in a crowd that has just seen more than it expected. There was a garden bench in the covered corridor that connected the museum to the outer courtyard. Lucas placed Camilla on it with care, knelt at her level, and placed 2 fingers on her pulse. Regular. He stayed like that for a few seconds, monitoring, while the city spread out below under the clear May sky. She regained consciousness gradually, the way consciousness returns when the body needs time, not in a jump, but in layers, each one bringing back a piece of what had happened. Lucas saw the exact moment she remembered, because her face passed through a quick reflex of pain that was not physical. "You are okay," he said, more as a fact than a question. Camilla raised her eyes. For a few seconds she just looked at him, and there was in that look something he didn't know how to fully name. Perhaps the confusion of someone waking up in a different place than where they expected to be, perhaps the recognition of a face that had become familiar in circumstances that now seemed too small for the size of what had happened. "What is happening in there?" Her voice came out raspy. "It is still happening." She closed her eyes for an instant. When she opened them, there was something different. Not the trained serenity of the senator's wife, but something more real, more tired, and at the same time more present. "They saw the documents," she said. It was not a question. They saw them. "Then they already think I did everything he said." Lucas didn't answer immediately. There was a tension in the air between them that was not hostility. It was the type of tension that exists when someone knows something the other doesn't yet know and is assessing the exact moment to say it. "What you don't know," he said slowly, "is what is going to happen in the next 10 minutes in there." Camilla turned her face to him with a different attention. "I went to the bar for the first time in August," said Lucas. "You arrived in the 3rd week. The first few times I just observed. Over time I understood what you were carrying, and after you told me about the documents, I began to investigate. The silence that followed had the specific quality of the silence that precedes understanding." Camilla stared at him without blinking. "You investigated Renato?" "Yes. Without warning me, because I needed to be sure before bringing anything to you, and because if you knew he would notice. You still lived with him. Any change in your behavior, he would have adjusted the plan," she completed, low. "Yes." A long pause. Inside, voices. The muffled sound of something that was changing configuration. "How much did you find?" she asked. "Enough. The shell companies, the real flow of money, the origin of the transfers, where they went, and recordings of him talking about what he intended to do to you." Camilla closed her eyes again. When she opened them, there was something in the corners of them. Not tears, but the pressure of tears that didn't want to come now, that would be left for later, when there was space for them. It was the look of someone who had carried a suspicion for a long time, and suddenly received confirmation that the suspicion was true, and that the confirmation was at once a relief and a devastation. 3 years, she said. At least. I signed everything. Her voice was firm, but there was something beneath it. I knew there was something wrong, but I didn't know the size. I was afraid to ask. When I asked, he changed the subject or got irritated, or said I didn't understand finance and that I was being paranoid. A pause. I ended up believing it was me. Lucas said nothing. There was a type of damage that words of comfort don't reach, and that only needs to be witnessed. What is happening in there? she asked again, this time with something different in her voice. "The hall screens must be lit now," said Lucas, looking discreetly at his watch. "They either are or will be soon." "What screens?" "I asked someone from the technical team to project the files onto the museum's audiovisual system when they received the signal. The signal was you leaving the hall." Camilla remained completely motionless. "What files?" "The same ones he presented, but complete. With the full money trail, with the recordings, with the records that show where the instructions really came from and where the values really went." Lucas paused. "And the video testimony of 2 of the directors of the shell companies who signed statements detailing Senator Cavalcanti's role in the operation." The air between them grew quiet for a few seconds. "Are you prepared a response?" she said, with a tone that was not quite gratitude and not quite incredulity, but something in the middle. "I prepared a correction. He chose the stage. I just prepared the second act." From inside the museum, through the stone and glass walls, came a different sound. Not the murmur of an entertained crowd. It was something louder, more irregular, the sound of 100 people simultaneously processing something they didn't expect. Then it became quiet in a specific way, the quiet of someone watching something that demands total attention. Lucas stood up. "Prosecutor Alcantara is in there," he said. "I know his work. When he sees the evidence, he won't ignore it." "And Renato?" "He will try to leave through the same exit he used to enter. But the narrative has changed, and the journalists he invited to witness your fall are going to witness something else." Camilla looked at the entrance of the corridor, at the illuminated city beyond the courtyard, at the open space ahead. There was something in the way she looked that Lucas recognized, not like someone who is planning the next step, but like someone who is, perhaps for the first time in a long time, simply present in the moment they are in. "Why did you do this?" she asked without looking at him. Lucas was silent for an instant. "Someone had to." Camilla didn't answer, but something in her posture changed in an almost imperceptible way, like when a tension that was so present it had become invisible begins, finally, to give way. Inside, the hall was becoming a very different place than what Renato Cavalcanti had planned. Inside the hall of the Museo do Ipiranga, the silence that had settled after Lucas's departure with Camilla in his arms lasted exactly the time Renato Cavalcanti needed to try to regain control. He climbed onto the stage again with the folder in hand, the microphone adjusted, the smile of someone who manages difficult situations with familiarity. There was a clear logic in what he intended to do. Camilla's fall was too dramatic for the narrative he had built, and he needed to transform that into something that favored him. The fragile wife, unable to face the truth that her own husband had been courageous enough to reveal. It was an angle that would work. "I apologize for the disturbance," he said into the microphone with a composure that was almost admirable in the coldness it required. "The situation is difficult for the whole family. But the truth needed to be told, and I prefer it be told here, with you, than discovered by other means." Some guests looked at him. Others still looked at the exit where Lucas had departed with Camilla. Businessman Helio Braga had his hands folded in front of his body with an expression that revealed nothing. Deputy Soraya Mendez whispered to the assistant beside her, and what was on her face now was no longer the neutral greeting of someone watching a show. There was a hesitation. It was then that the screens lit up. The museum had been equipped with the most modern audiovisual system available, a requirement of the last renovation, justified by the need to serve large-scale congresses and exhibitions. 4 LED panels on the side walls of the hall, generally used for decorative projections during events. That night they had been programmed to do something else. The image that appeared on the 4 panels simultaneously was not decorative. It was a spreadsheet, with columns and rows, with values, dates, account identifications, and company names. And in the top right corner, in clear letters on a white background, an indication of origin: Independent Audit, Reconstruir Foundation, Complete Report. The difference between this document and the ones Renato had distributed was immediate to anyone with minimal financial training. Renato's documents showed the outflows, the values that had left the foundation's accounts with Camilla's signature. The document on the screen showed where those values had gone, the destination companies, the tax IDs, the registered addresses, and then on a second screen that opened beside it, the corporate ownership chain of those companies, who the partners were, who the directors were, and what was the common denominator that linked all of them to a single name. Renato Cavalcanti. Not directly. The man had been careful, but through a series of individuals and legal entities that, arranged in a line, formed a path that began with him and returned to him with the inevitability of a circle. Prosecutor Alcantara was the first to approach the screens. He stood before one of the panels with the expression of someone who recognizes solid work and is evaluating every line with the seriousness of someone who knows that what he is seeing has legal weight. One of the journalists present, Paulo Rios from the state's largest economics publication, had already taken out his cell phone and was filming the panels with the concentrated attention of someone who is before something that is going to change an entire newsroom's workweek. Renato stepped off the stage, still with the folder in his hand, but different now. Not the gesture of authority with which he had raised the documents minutes before, but something closer to a shield. He walked toward the nearest panel with the expression of someone assessing a situation before speaking, and there was something in the way the audience stepped back slightly around him that was new. It was not the respectful distance that accompanies people with power. It was the other type. "This is a fraud," he said, into the microphone he still had in his hand, his voice firm but with a different quality now, louder than it needed to be, as if the volume could compensate for something that was beginning to lack. Fake documents projected to confuse. Someone is trying to divert attention. The third screen lit up. This time it was not a spreadsheet. It was a video. The quality was good enough for the face to be clearly recognizable. A man in his 50s, grey suit, sitting in front of a camera in an office setting, identified in the caption as Marcello Viotti, founding director of Viotti Participações Limitada, one of the companies that appeared on the spreadsheet. The testimony lasted 4 minutes. Marcello Viotti spoke with the diction of someone who weighed every word before saying it, describing in detail how he had been approached by an intermediary 2 years before, what the proposal had been, who had authorized the corporate structure, and who had defined the values and transfer schedules. Renato Cavalcanti's name appeared 3 times in the testimony, in different contexts, with specific details that were not the type of thing one invents. The hall became completely motionless. 100 people, champagne forgotten in their hands, eyes on the screens, processing in real time the complete inversion of everything that had been said in the last 40 minutes. The journalists no longer pretended to discreetly take notes. They filmed openly, exchanged messages, communicated something to their newsrooms. Prosecutor Alcantara had the phone to his ear, his voice low and his eyes on the screens. The fourth screen came on with an audio recording transcribed into text simultaneously, words in large font so everyone could read. The voice was Renato's. The content was a conversation with the trusted assistant, recorded in an office, discussing in detail how the public accusation would be structured, what Camilla's role in the narrative would be, and how to ensure that the investigations that followed found exactly what had been planted. There was no way to contest the voice. Everyone in the hall had heard that voice dozens of times. Renato Cavalcanti stood in the middle of the hall, alone in a circle that had formed around him without anyone having moved on purpose. Just people naturally moving away from a center that had become toxic. The hall door opened. 2 men entered, not in suits. Suits were the uniform of that night, and they knew it. Dark blazers, identification on the lapel. Prosecutor Alcantara met them halfway, exchanged a few words in a low voice, nodded, and Renato Cavalcanti, who had arrived that night as the man who controlled every detail, saw the 2 men approach with an expression that was the exact inverse of the expression with which he had climbed onto the stage. Helio Braga turned to a partner beside him and said something that the other heard without responding. Deputy Soraya Mendez was already with the phone to her ear, probably calling her own legal advisor. The journalists continued recording. And the destroyed cake on the marble floor, white and gold fondant scattered in fragments among the shards of the internal structure, remained as the only element of the hall that had stayed exactly where it had fallen, without anyone having thought of picking it up. The spectacle Renato had planned had happened, just with inverted protagonists. The covered corridor was quiet when Camilla heard the steps approaching. They were not Lucas's steps. He was sitting beside her on the garden bench, motionless, with that quality of silence she had learned to recognize as one of the few forms of presence that demanded nothing from her in return. It was the assistant Fernanda, the journalist who had spoken with her at the beginning of the night, who appeared at the entrance of the corridor with her cell phone in hand and an expression Camilla had never seen on her face. "Camilla." Fernanda stopped a few meters away. "Are you okay?" "I am standing," Camilla replied. Fernanda looked briefly at Lucas, then back at her. "The hall screens, the videos." She paused like someone checking if the words she was about to use were the right ones. "Everything inside has changed." Camilla didn't answer, but something in her shoulders dropped slightly. "Alcantara is with the authorities now," Fernanda continued. "Renato is being taken to provide clarifications." Another pause. "I needed to tell you personally. Before publishing anything, I needed to see you. You are going to publish it. Yes, it's my job, but I'm going to publish the whole story, not the version he brought." Camila looked at the city below for a few seconds. The lights of São Paulo didn't care about galas or ruins. They simply continued, constant and indifferent as always. "Thank you, Fernanda." The journalist nodded slightly and went back inside. Lucas remained quiet beside Camilla. There was between them the type of silence that doesn't need filling, that exists between people who have reached a point where words are optional. After a few minutes, Camilla said, "You knew it was going to work." "I thought it was going to work. There's a difference." She turned her face to him with something that wasn't quite a smile, but had the same temperature. "What's the difference?" "Knowing is arrogance. Thinking is calculation with a margin for error. I prefer to work with the second one." Camilla looked at her hands. The diamond ring was on her ring finger, exactly where it had been for the last 4 years, a weight so habitual that it had stopped feeling like weight. She closed her hand slowly, feeling the metal between her fingers, and then opened it again. 3 years, she said. "Sometimes I wonder when exactly I stopped being myself inside that marriage, if it was all at once or if it was little by little, so slowly that it wasn't possible to notice while it was happening." Lucas didn't answer immediately. There was a type of honesty in that question that deserved more than a quick answer. "Elegant prisons are like that," he said after a moment. "They don't have visible bars. They are made of small restrictions that add up, of explanations that seem reasonable, but add up to isolation, of a version of yourself that is gradually replaced by the version that is more convenient for the one in control." Pause. "The fact that you are asking this question means you still have both versions inside you." Camilla was quiet for a while. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked. "To see what no one else sees. In places I prefer not to describe in detail." There was something light in his tone, not humor exactly, but the inflection of someone making peace with their own past without needing to expose it all. "The essential thing is that what I learned in those places was useful tonight." Camilla nodded slowly. "Are you going to continue with this work?" she asked. "Probably. Even after this. Especially after this." A pause. "Cases like this remind me why the work is worth it." Inside the museum, the sound of voices had changed configuration again. It was no longer the murmur of an audience suspended between scandal and curiosity. There was a more defined movement now. The sound of people organizing to leave, the diffuse movement of those who need to go, but are still processing what they just saw. Cars being called, assistants being summoned by phone, decisions being made about what to say and what not to say before having more information. Renato's assistant appeared at the entrance of the corridor with an expression Camilla recognized. She had worked alongside him at enough events to know that specific expression meant things had gone out of control in a way that had no quick solution. He said nothing to her. He just turned and left. Camilla observed the empty space he had left. "You're going to need a lawyer," said Lucas. "A good one, to ensure your position is clear from the start. I have a friend from college, Eduardo Mancini. He was always the best in the class. Call him tomorrow morning." "I will." Prosecutor Alcantara appeared a few minutes later, alone with the contained expression of someone who is in professional mode, but who cannot completely hide that he is before a case that will occupy his agenda for months. He stopped before Camilla and gave a slight nod of his head. "Dr. Camilla, I know it is not the most appropriate moment, but I will need a formal conversation in the coming days." His voice was careful, without the pressure of an accusation. "There is much that needs to be clarified, and today's documents clearly indicate that the situation is more complex than was presented tonight." A pause. "Do you have a lawyer?" "I will have one tomorrow." "Well," he looked briefly at Lucas without any explicit question, but with the recognition of someone who knows that some things do not need to be said out loud. "Take care." And he left. The corridor returned to silence. São Paulo continued down there, firm and indifferent, the city that had served as the setting for that night without having been consulted on the matter. Camilla stared at it for a long time. There was a quality in the air now that was different from the air before, and she was trying to identify what had changed. It wasn't just the fact that the night had ended in a different way than Renato had planned. It was something more internal, harder to name. Like when a pain that has been present for so long that you forgot it is pain begins finally to give way. It doesn't disappear all at once, but you feel the difference. She looked at the ring, and this time her hand moved differently. Camilla took off the ring. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. There was no longer an audience. There were no cameras. There was no one to witness besides Lucas, who stood looking at her without saying anything. The ring slid off her finger with the lightness of something that had long ceased to belong to the place where it was. She held it closed in the palm of her hand for a few seconds, feeling the small and precise weight of the metal and stones, a weight that had accompanied every part of the last 4 years, every dinner, every event, every signature, every night she had slept beside a man who planned to use her and discard her with the coldness of an accounting piece. Then she opened her hand and looked at it. It was a beautiful ring. It had been chosen with care, or perhaps with the calculation of someone who knew that the appearance of attention worked better than real attention. Camilla could no longer separate the two things clearly, and probably wouldn't for some time. This was the type of damage that has no quick fix. "You're going to be okay," said Lucas. It wasn't an easy promise, the kind people make to fill silences. It was an assessment. "I know," she said. And there was something in the way she said it that was different from the way she said things before, without the layer of performance, without the automatic adjustment she had developed to appear more secure than she was. It was simple. It was true. The last guests were leaving through the museum's main lobby when they went back inside. The hall had been transformed in the last 40 minutes into a scene that mixed the remains of a gala party with the beginning of something that would take months to be fully understood. The white orchid arrangements remained in the centers of the tables, intact and completely out of context. The golden chandeliers still generously illuminated a space that had emptied. And on the floor, in an area marked off by a tape that one of the prosecution's assistants had placed around, the fragments of the cake, white and gold fondant mixed with sponge and cream structure, remained exactly where they had fallen. Camilla stopped at the entrance of the hall and looked at all of it for an instant. There was an irony in the details that she was beginning to be able to recognize. The event had been planned by Renato to be memorable, and it had been, just not in the way he had imagined. The journalist Fernanda approached one last time before leaving, with the notepad on her arm and her coat on the other. "I'm going to need a conversation from you," she said, with her usual direct professionalism, but with something softer in her voice. "When you are ready. There is no hurry." "I will call," said Camilla. "It doesn't have to be this week. Maybe it will be." A pause. "Maybe it's important that the right version is told soon, before other versions occupy the space." Fernanda nodded with a respect that was genuine. "Whenever you want." And she left. Businessman Helio Braga passed Camilla on the way out without stopping, but he gave a nod of his head that she interpreted as the minimum he could offer without compromising anything. Deputy Soraya Mendez had left earlier, probably to make the calls that the current situation required. Most of the other guests had departed, with the characteristic discretion of people who had just watched something they preferred to process in private before discussing in public. Lucas stayed beside Camilla while she walked through the hall one last time. She took her bag from a chair where she had left it before the speech began. She stopped before the destroyed cake and stood looking at it for a moment. Not with sadness, but with something closer to recognition. "I chose this cake," she said suddenly. "I spent 2 hours with the confectioner. I wanted it to be perfect." Lucas stayed quiet. "I didn't know what the night was for," she continued. "Renato said it was just the foundation gala, that I needed to look good." She looked at the fragments on the floor. "I did everything right. The dress, the bun, the cake." Long pause. "And even so." "Even so," Lucas agreed without completing the sentence in any other way. Sometimes it's enough to repeat what the person said, so they know they were heard. Camilla turned to him. "Are you going to keep showing up at the bar?" she asked. "Probably." "I'm going to keep showing up too, for a while at least." She looked at the city through the high windows. "It will be strange at first, knowing I can enter and leave places without having to give explanations to anyone. It will become less strange. How long does it take? It depends on how much you let go." She understood what he meant without needing to ask for an explanation. There were things she had ceased to be during the marriage that wouldn't return automatically. They would need to be rediscovered or perhaps reinvented, because the people who exist on the other side of experiences like that are rarely exactly the same as the ones who entered. This could be a loss, but it could also be something else. The museum security guard approached gently, informing them that the space needed to be closed. Camilla nodded, took the coat that was on the chair beside her bag, and looked at the hall one last time. The chandeliers began to be turned off in sequence. The white orchids in the centers of the tables lost color as the light diminished. The screens on the side walls, which less than an hour ago had changed the course of everything, were dark, and the destroyed cake on the floor was left in the dark before Camilla finished leaving. On the sidewalk in front of the museum, the São Paulo air had that specific freshness of May dawns, not cold enough to bother, but present enough to be felt. The city was in night mode, the flow of cars reduced, the sidewalks almost free. High up, the Ipiranga was illuminated from below, the clean columns of the restored facade projecting long shadows on the ground. Camilla stopped on the sidewalk and faced the city. Lucas was a few steps behind, giving space. "Do you need a car?" he asked. "I'm going to call one." She opened her cell phone and looked at the screen for a second. There were messages, dozens of them. Acquaintances, distant relatives, people who hadn't called for months. She closed the cell phone without reading. There was time for that later. "Lucas," he approached. "Thank you," she said, looking directly at him for the first time that night without the tension that had characterized every previous look. "Not just for what you did here, for the bar too, for listening when there was no one else." Lucas was silent for a moment. "You spoke," he said. "I just stayed." The car arrived in 3 minutes. Camilla got in, placed her bag on her lap, and looked out the window as the vehicle pulled away. Lucas remained on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, the city in the background. She didn't look back immediately. She kept looking forward, at the open streets of São Paulo, at the city that continued as it always continued, without pausing for galas, for accusations, for revelations, or for beginnings. It just followed its course. And then, when the museum had already disappeared in the rearview mirror, she opened her closed hand and looked at the ring she was still holding since the corridor. She placed it in the bottom of her bag, and she looked forward. 3 months after the night at the Museu do Ipiranga, São Paulo was in August, the month when the city decides to face winter head-on, the bare trees on the avenues, the sky too clear during the day and too cold at night. It was the type of month that invites balance, an inventory of what stayed and what went away. Camilla woke up at 7 in the morning in an apartment in Jardins that she had chosen alone. It wasn't the largest apartment she had ever inhabited, nor the most luxurious, but it had a balcony that caught the morning sun and a kitchen with a window to the street, and there was something in that specific combination she had decided was enough. It was hers. Every detail chosen without needing to take into account another opinion, another schedule, another need other than her own. She made coffee, took it to the balcony, and stood looking at the street below. An old lady walked a dog. A bicycle delivery person passed quickly. A child waited at the gate of the house across the street, probably waiting for school. The city in mourning mode, without performance, without gala. The process had advanced within the rhythm of justice, which is not fast, but which had been more consistent than Camilla had dared to expect. Prosecutor Alcantara had built the case with the documents provided by Lucas, the video-recorded testimonies, and the material obtained from Renato's conversations. Camilla's position had been clarified with the help of Eduardo Mancini, who had acted with the precision and dedication of someone with something to prove. Her signatures had been contextualized, each one traced back to the specific circumstance in which it had been obtained, with testimonies from Foundation employees who, free from the fear the Cavalcanti name had imposed, spoke about the dynamic of control they had observed for years. Renato Cavalcanti was answering for his actions. There was nothing satisfactory in the word when Camilla thought it. No sense of triumph, no euphoria. There was only the emotional equivalent of a weight being removed from a structure that had supported that weight for too long. A relief that was not festive, but was real. The interview with Fernanda had come out in June. Camilla had told her story with the careful precision of someone who chooses every word, knowing that the wrong words would make her a victim and the right ones would make her what she really was, a person who had been placed in a trap and had managed to get out. The repercussions had been greater than she expected and smaller than the people around her predicted, which she considered a good balance. She had received messages from women she didn't know, from São Paulo and other states, saying that the story had given a name to things they themselves were living. These messages she had read with attention. She had decided after thinking for a few weeks that she wanted to work in that direction, not as a public figure. That season had come to an end along with the marriage, but in another way. She had talked to an organization in Pinheiros that served women in situations similar to what she had lived, offering legal and psychological support. They had accepted her offer to contribute. She had started the previous week. The coffee was cooling in the mug. She drank what remained and kept looking at the street. Lucas had appeared at the bar the week following the gala, as promised, or as not promised, which was practically the same thing. They had met a few times since then, always in the same bar, always in the same type of comfortable silence that had characterized the first nights. There was an ease in this dynamic, that she didn't want to rush into anything because rushing it would be transforming it into something else, before fully understanding what it was. What she knew was that there was one person in the world for whom she didn't need to appear to be anything, who stayed beside her without demanding any specific version, and that, in the August inventory, was a big thing. The phone vibrated on the table. Eduardo Mancini, an update on the process. She replied with a brief thank you and went back to looking at the street. In her bag, in some compartment where it had been placed 3 months before and never removed, was the ring. She had thought about returning it, selling it, discarding it in some way that would make the gesture definitive. But she had decided for now to leave it where it was, not as a memory of something she wanted to preserve, but because she had not yet found the right gesture. There would be an appropriate moment. She would recognize it when it arrived. For now, there was the balcony, the coffee, the street below with its people going to their places, the indifferent and faithful city, which was the same at the galas and on the mornings in a new apartment, which didn't judge or applaud, just continued. Camilla stayed on the balcony until the sun rose higher and the cold subsided enough for the city to begin to seem like itself again. Then she went inside, put the mug in the sink, took her coat from the hanger, and left. There were places to go. There were things to do. There was an entire life to begin belonging to her again. And São Paulo was out there, with all its noisy and impatient grandeur, ready to receive whoever arrived with open eyes. End of story. If Camilla's story touched something in you, dear listeners, know that it was born exactly for that. To give a name to that which sometimes finds no words. To remind you that behind every appearance of a perfect life, an invisible struggle may exist, and that the first step toward freedom begins the moment someone decides to be truly seen. If you have made it this far, you are also part of this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of life. We have much more to tell together. Leave your like. It is simple, but it means the story reached you and was worth the journey. And in the comments tell us, which moment of Camilla's stayed with you? We read everything until the next story.